biggest threat to church-state separation right now?
Well, we have, just in the State Department actually, this may not be the biggest example, but something that that's been on my mind because it's a very recent development. They just appointed this advisory committee to redefine human rights as so-called natural rights. And if you read into this, again, don't try this at home, but if you really read into this, that's basically about rejecting the secular idea of human rights. That these are rights that belong to everybody, no matter who we are, where we come from, no matter our faith, that are then expressed in law, including international treaties, and making it about something rooted more in our Judeo-Christian heritage. So religious freedom, yes, but LGBT rights.
What's the committee called, Congressman Malinowski? I'm just curious.
I don't remember what it's called. It's an advisory group on natural, something incorporating that phrase. And, you know, it's not, look, they already thought these things, right? So appointing some group of academics to advise them on it isn't fundamentally going to change things, because we already have the ideology there. But it's a sign of how radically some of our institutions are being changed if we're not vigilant, if we're not doing what we're doing here, which is speaking out. Look, I tend to be more optimistic about these things, right? My job is to point out now what's going wrong, but I honestly do think the vast majority of Americans are reasonable, pragmatic people. We're not ideological. We are compassionate, we are decent to each other, and our institutions are still functioning. They're under great strain, and we can't take them for granted, but they are still functioning. And I do think we're going to overcome that. And separation of church and state is such a core American principle. 4 years is not enough to completely erase respect for that principle.
Thank you.
Sir.
Many of the actions taken by the Congress and administration have improved the economy, but do you see, what about the deficit we're running? Is something being done to get that, because it's not sustainable, the current deficit?
Thank you for raising that. Yes, we did have a stimulus. The tax bill in 2017, any economist would have said, you're putting that money into the economy, and so it will provide some economic stimulus. But it didn't provide very much. It looks like it was pretty much a sugar high. A lot of the corporate part of the tax cut, more than 50% of the benefits that corporations got from that tax cut were plowed into corporate share buybacks. And one of the most interesting reactions to this recently from the Republican side, Republican Senator Marco Rubio, who I've known for many years, put out a paper recently basically saying there's something fundamentally wrong in corporate America if they're spending all of their tax windfall on corporate share buybacks. It either means that they can't find anything to invest in America, or it means that they are placing short-term returns to shareholders above the long-term good of investing in the economy, in jobs, and in their own long-term future. And it's almost certainly the latter.
That used to be illegal.
Well,
late 70s.
that may be, I don't know that. That's interesting.
But what about the deficit?
But anyway, and so we basically, in order to do this, in order to give ourselves that short-term sugar high, we passed a tax bill that over 10 years, if we do nothing about it, adds about $2 trillion to the deficit. I completely agree with you, that is unsustainable. Completely unsustainable. If we do nothing, within 10 years, get this, annual interest on the federal debt will be equal to what we spend on the military, and significantly more than we spend on all domestic programs put together. completely unsustainable. How do we deal with that? There are only two, if we're honest with ourselves, there are really only two variables that we can affect. Number one is the tax bill. We have to go back and do tax reform again in a more fiscally responsible way. And we're not going to do that with the Senate. So that's on my 2021 list. Number two is the cost of health care in this country. As many of you know, we pay per capita twice as much for health care in America as the average citizen of most other wealthy countries in the world, and our health care outcomes are not better. In fact, our life expectancy in some cases a little worse than some of the countries that are spending a lot less on health care. To be fair, that's not just the health care system. A lot of other things about how we live our lives in America that unfortunately contribute to that. But it's certainly a very telling statistic. And this is why we need deeper health care reform in this country. Partly for access and equity and justice, because we want everyone to have access to health care, but also because we cannot sustain this level of health care expenditures. That translates into Medicare and Medicaid being much more expensive, a much higher deficit. If we could magically, and we can't magically, but if we could magically have the per capita health care costs of most other wealthy countries, the deficit would be gone.
We got one more question. Time for one more question.
No, we got time for more. I'm going to be late for my next thing. I was late.
We have a messaging crisis in our party, and the crisis is we're boring. And we have just way too much. I mean, our facts are great. They make sense. We're the smart ones. We learned a lot of lessons, I see my friend over there, from our fracking fights, street theater, and being outrageous, and doing things that get attention, get us into the news. So, I don't know, maybe it's just, we need AOC to be followed all over the place, but what can you suggest are things to do to draw attention to get people who are tuned out to Democrats' messages?
Well, again, I don't want to put this in partisan terms, right? It's whatever our issue is. I actually think I'm gonna challenge your premise a little bit in an optimistic way. I actually think Americans right now are more engaged with the issues that affect our lives than at any point in recent memory. And thank you, Mr. President, for our voter turnout in CD7 in 2018 was 60%. 60% in a midterm election. Voter turnout nationwide in 2018 was the highest turnout in a midterm election since before World War I. That is huge. Everyone's saying, oh, people don't care, they're apathetic. Young people, youth turnout skyrocketed. It's not as high as it needs to be, for goodness sakes. But huge increase from 2014 to 2018. And it's not just people on one side of the spectrum. It's everywhere. And look at, you know, people were not coming in large numbers to meetings like this in this district before. Think of all the extra volunteering that people are doing. Think of all the activist groups that have sprung up around the bigger situation we're facing in this country, but also specific issues, whether it's healthcare or gun violence. Even my old issues, which people think were boring, national security. When I went to the first Women's March in the mall, one of my favorite things was seeing all these activists with NATO signs. It
was an acronym for something else.
No, it was NATO. No, it was. They were out there. They were demonstrating for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And you know, so look, it's a tough moment, but the silver lining is that we are all learning about things that we didn't know about before, the emoluments clause to the Constitution, and Office of Legal Counsel's opinions about whether presidents can be, it's just, we're all so much more engaged and smarter. And I know this room, that by virtue of you being here, you're probably, more politically engaged than maybe the average person in our community, but I get this everywhere. I go into our high schools, our middle schools in this district. There was an NPR story a few days ago about an event I did at Warren Middle School and how the kids were asking questions about, Congressman, what are you going to do about the Uyghur detention camps in China? Sixth graders. The first question was, what are you going to do about our property taxes? Which was great. Yes. Your parents are paying. Yes. And look at this wonderful school you're getting. That's I also said that. What's your answer about the property taxes? So I kind of punted to my part of that, since Congress, thankfully, doesn't set property taxes. But what we do need to do, and this is a huge issue for all of us, is getting them deductible again.
Yes.
And so we will be, I'm confident this may be one of those House-Senate things where we get halfway there in the House this term and all the way next. Young man here.
Some people here are thinking about PSE&G's monster pool project, and so I was wondering, what are you going to do about it? Because they're going to be planting it around my school and the area around where I live.
Yeah, well, so
They can hurt the innocent lives of children.
I know. When I was driving up here, I saw a lot of signs in people's front yards. So, and that already tells me you guys are organizing, right?
Yes.
And there you go. Okay.
We're ready.
And we were talking here before, and this is not, and I'll be honest with you, this isn't something that the Congress can control from Washington. But it is something where people like you, including kids who can't vote yet, actually do have some power. If you care about an issue enough, and you're willing to take time out of your busy day, and I'm sure you have homework and other things that are much more fun than talking about power lines. But if you care enough about it that you're willing to come to meetings and speak up, and have the courage to speak up about it, then you can make a difference.